shoulder tonight. Everybody stand by. I want to bring in our chief political correspondent, Dana Bash. She's just come from a meeting with the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Dana, the Speaker spoke about the last time she had a chance to have a conversation with the president, I'm told. What did she say?
That's right. It was a small meeting with reporters from the networks, and the gist of what she said, Wolf, was that they spoke late last week when she re-invited the president to come for State of the Union, and that they did have, I think by the standards of their relationship, which is pretty non-existent, a relatively nice and lengthy, about 10 to 12 minutes, conversation about areas where they can work together. She talked about prescription drug prices, reducing those, and mostly about infrastructure. She talked about the ways where she believes that they actually can work together on infrastructure, as long as, she said, the president doesn't repeat some of the Republican proposals for infrastructure of the past, primarily the notion of it being a public-private partnership, with most of it on the side of the private side. She said on that, quote, "Goodbye, Wolf."
Yeah. All right. I'm told she was. Because if you hear some of the president's supporters, they're really going after her, saying she is really captive of the far left of the Democratic Party. And they make the same argument about Chuck Schumer, that they don't control the situation anymore because they're too weak.
That's right. And that was the gist of my question. And that's why she was, she really shot back in a pretty stern way, saying that's just not true. And she and Chuck Schumer was at this small meeting as well. They insisted that these bipartisan negotiations, the so-called conference committee, which is the way legislation is supposed to be done, which are going on over border security right now, they insisted that they see some progress. They hear some progress from the negotiators. I will tell you that other people are less rosy about those negotiations, but they are certainly looking at that. One other thing that I just want to add to this, even though we do not expect from our reporters at the White House that the president will talk about a national emergency tonight, Nancy Pelosi said we're going to wait. We're going to wait to talk about that. But when we do, we're going to have a very clear lesson on civics about who is in charge of the power of the purse.
Very interesting. All right, Dan, thanks very much for that report, David Shelley. And so where's this heading?
Well, I mean, what Dana just described is that Donald Trump is going to walk into the House chamber tonight with a new reality. I mean, it is going to be the visual of Nancy Pelosi hanging over his shoulder, but she also has some political juice right now. Her numbers are on the rise. Her favorability numbers, our poll yesterday showed 51%, slim majority of Americans want the country to be led in the direction by the congressional Democrats versus 40% who want it to be put in the direction by Donald Trump. She's got the political juice right now. How he deals with that tonight, not an overt acknowledgement, but how he deals with that in his approach tonight is going to be something I'm watching for. It's
going to be an important and fascinating night. I think we'll be watching, all of us, very closely as we await President Trump's State of the Union address. CNN has obtained new details of a new United Nations report accusing the North Korean dictator of concealing his nuclear and missile capability. Stand by. We have new information.
This is CNN Breaking News.
The breaking news tonight, new details emerging right now on the President's State of the Union address that he will give in just a few hours. It was postponed by the last government shutdown. It's being delivered with another one, though, looming. Sources tell CNN the president hopes to hit the reset button with a bipartisan appeal for unity, but his standoff with Democrats over funding over his border wall certainly continues. Also breaking, CNN has learned federal prosecutors are now seeking interviews with Trump Organization executives, and they've subpoenaed the Trump Inaugural Committee at the same time. We'll talk about the breaking news and more with Congressman Ted Lieu of the Judiciary and Foreign Affairs Committees. And our correspondents and analysts are also standing by. First, let's go to our chief White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. Jim, the State of the Union address is now less than 3 hours away.
That's right, Wolf. It's closing in fast, and aides say President Trump will deliver a State of the Union speech that is aimed at restoring some unity to a deeply divided Washington. The president will make another pitch for his border wall tonight, an issue that has divided Republicans and Democrats almost like nothing else. Mr. Trump is so fixated on his border wall these days, I'm told he's even talked about painting some of the fencing that already exists. Still licking his wounds after the government shutdown, President Trump will try to hit the reset button with a State of the Union address that calls for unity at a time when the nation is in a serious state of disunion.
He is in the way that he's calling for bipartisanship and unity and more compromise and cooperation and less divisiveness, retribution politics, as he calls it. And so that implicitly addresses the fact that there's a divided government.
But hours before the president's speech, he was already fighting with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
The president will say the state of our union is strong, but the American people know the state of the Trump administration is in chaos.
The president fired back, tweeting, "I see Schumer is already criticizing my State of the Union speech, even though he hasn't seen it yet. He's just upset that he didn't win the Senate after spending a fortune like he thought he would." Mr. Trump's other sparring partner, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, will be seated right behind him during the address, with all eyes watching to see if he'll show the same respect that was on display when George W. Bush was president.
Tonight I have the high privilege and distinct honor of my own as the first president to begin the State of the Union message with these words: Madam Speaker.
The deep divide can be seen in the guests attending tonight's speech, with the White House inviting families of victims killed by undocumented immigrants. Pelosi invited Chef Jose Andres, who provided food to federal workers during the government shutdown, and Fred Gutenberg, the father of a child killed in last year's Parkland school shooting. One of the flashpoints of the night may be over the president's quest for a border wall. As he tweeted earlier in the day, tremendous numbers of people are coming up through Mexico in the hopes of flooding our southern border. We have sent additional military. We will build a human wall if necessary. The president is so fixated on his wall that he told a group of surrogates he wants to paint a section of border fencing where it meets the ocean in San Diego. Mr. Trump complained he was told by a general that painting that area could harm the environment. The White House vows the president is determined to get his wall.
As the president said, you can call it a wall, you can call it a barrier. That's something that we have to see happen, and that's something the president's not going to stop until he does.
As for the president's threat to declare a national emergency to get his wall, a growing number of Senate Republicans are raising concerns.
I am concerned about it. I think it's of dubious constitutionality.
The president is also expected to devote up to half of his speech to foreign policy on topics ranging from the crisis in Venezuela to Syria and Afghanistan. Some clarity may be helpful over at the Pentagon, as one top general told Congress military commanders were unaware of the president's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria.
I was not consulted.
Also tonight, the president is expected to call for new efforts to lower the cost of prescription drugs and improve the nation's infrastructure. The White House hopes those kinds of measures will bring Democrats back to the bargaining table. As for the president's wall, we're told he's been meeting with contractors over here at the White House to discuss that idea. The wall is likely to be one of those topics, Wolf, as you know, that's on the table when the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, he's expected to host a group of bipartisan lawmakers up at Camp David this weekend. It's unclear whether or not a speech tonight or a meeting at Camp David this weekend will get the president that wall he wants. Wolf.
It certainly is unclear. All right, Jim Acosta at the White House. Thanks very much. From the White House, let's go up to Capitol Hill. Our senior congressional correspondent, Manu Raju, is joining us. Manu, we know the president isn't planning to declare a national emergency in his speech tonight. That's what we've repeatedly been told. But Republicans are concerned that the order could come sometime after the speech if there's no deal on a border wall. What's the latest?
Yeah, that's right. And there's bipartisan concern tonight about the possibility of a national emergency declaration by this president. Republicans and Democrats alike are worried about the precedent this would set. Democrats in the House today circulating a set of talking points, raising concerns about how they believe that it could violate federal law going forward, also outlining the procedures that would need to be taken, or that would likely be taken, to try to get Congress to block this from going forward, not to mention the legal fight that could also ensue. Now, Republicans on the Senate side, Wolf, also have been pushing back. John Thune, the number 2 Republican, making it very clear that he does not support this effort going forward, and neither does John Cornyn, another influential member of that conference. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has made it very clear that this could open up a hornet's nest on Capitol Hill if the president were to go this route, because he could not stop a vote from going forward. Ultimately, Wolf, it's a question about whether Republicans would vote to block this from actually moving forward. Separately, though, those talks to avert a government shutdown by February 15th still moving forward. Members who are negotiating, Wolf, tell me tonight that they are optimistic that they're moving closer to what they can ultimately reach a deal on how to secure the border, but Democrats still say there's going to be no money for the president's wall in that demand. And will the president ultimately accept what Congress reaches, a deal that they reach? That's also a big question tonight. So we'll see if the president lays out any more clarity about what he could ultimately support from this bipartisan negotiation that's happening, and whether he signals that he's going to make that nationally emergency declaration. Wolf.
As you know, Manu, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she'll be standing right over the president's shoulder later tonight. Tell us about the optics of this year's State of the Union address. How it will be different for the president?
Yeah, and you're going to see a lot of members, particularly Democratic members, try to make some political points with the guests that they're planning on bringing. Even the members who are running in 2020, the Democratic members, people like Kristen Gillibrand, she's bringing a decorated transgender Navy member as her guest. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren bringing in a furloughed employee who was the victim of the most recent 35-day government shutdown. But Republicans, too, trying to make that point. Melania Trump in her box is going to invite a kid whose last name is Trump, who's been bullied because of the fact that his last name is Trump. So you're going to see members, both sides, try to make their points, and women wearing white in solidarity with other women in the suffragette movement. So we'll see Nancy Pelosi sitting behind the president. The question will, how often will she get up and applaud this president, and how often will she be sitting down as the president faces a divided Congress before a State of the Union address for the first time in his presidency?
Sure, somebody will be counting all of that and noticing all the symbolic moves. Indeed, Manu, thank you very much. Manu Raju is up on Capitol Hill. There's more breaking news right now. CNN has learned that federal prosecutors in New York have requested interviews with top executives over at the Trump Organization. That news coming just hours after we learned they've also subpoenaed the Trump Inaugural Committee for documents related to donors, vendors, and finances. Our political correspondent Sarah Murray is working the story for us. She's here with me. Sarah, what's the latest?
Well, Wolf, we've obviously heard President Trump complain about the Mueller investigation. He's called it a witch hunt a number of times, but now he may have additional legal headaches on his hands as prosecutors in New York look into not one, but two Trump-related entities. Federal investigators from the Southern District of New York are asking to speak with top executives of the Trump Organization, sources tell CNN. Another sign President Trump's legal woes may not end with the special counsel. It's not clear why investigators from the U.S. Attorney's Office want to talk to people inside the Trump Organization. But in recent months, CNN has learned federal prosecutors have taken up at least two investigations into Trump-related entities. The focus on the president's business comes at the same time federal prosecutors in New York are scrutinizing the committee that planned the events around his inauguration. A sweeping subpoena aimed at the committee calls for documents related to virtually every donor, donation, and even the possibility of donations made by foreign nationals. It also calls for information about attendees at committee events and vendors the committee worked with. A spokeswoman for the committee said it would cooperate with the inquiry. The subpoena shows prosecutors are investigating a laundry list of potential crimes: conspiracy against the U.S., false statements, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, disclosure violations, contributions from foreign nations, and contributions from straw donors. The committee has already come under public scrutiny for how it raised and spent an eye-popping $100 million on Trump's inaugural festivities. And Mueller's team previously struck a plea deal with a Washington lobbyist who admitted to illegally procuring inauguration tickets for a Ukrainian oligarch. The lobbyist, Samuel Patton, appears to still be cooperating. The subpoena from New York prosecutors targets only one person by name, Imad Zuberi, and his investment firm, Avenue Ventures, LLC.
I saw there was one individual named, a gentleman who apparently had been a fundraiser for both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, President Obama and Secretary Clinton, and he was trying to, according to the reports I read, trying to get inroads into the Trump inaugural.
After backing President Obama and Hillary Clinton, Zuberi's firm donated $900,000 to Trump's inaugural fund, according to federal election records. But the subpoena doesn't reveal why prosecutors may be interested in his donations. A spokesman for Zuberi said he's unaware of the subpoena aside from news reports. If in fact he is named in this subpoena, never mind somehow named alone, he is bewildered why. Adding, Imad, as always, gave only his own money from his own resources. Today, the White House distanced itself from the investigation.
What I do know at this point is this has nothing to do with the White House, and for anything specific and further, I'd refer you back to the Trump Inaugural Committee.
Now, Wolf, obviously, Sarah Sanders can say that this has nothing to do with the White House, but it clearly has a lot to do with President Trump. The fact that investigators are digging into the Trump organization, that could be potentially more dangerous to President Trump, to his family members, than anything we've seen from the Mueller probe. And it's the kind of inquiry that could stretch on for years, potentially for as long as Donald Trump is president.
Yeah, the Trump organization, the Trump Foundation, the Trump inaugural, they're looking into a lot of stuff. Various investigators. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that report. Let's get some more on all of this. Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu of California is joining us. He's a member of both the Judiciary and the Foreign Affairs Committees. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Wolf.
All right, so what do you think? These federal prosecutors, they're now requesting these interviews with top Trump organization officials. What and who do you think they're investigating?
Well, let me first say that the level of corruption associated with Donald Trump and his associates is extraordinary. It looks like virtually every organization Donald Trump has touched is now under investigation. We know that these are prosecutors that are separate from Special Counsel Mueller's office. They all took an oath to uphold the Constitution. They did not take an oath to the president. They're going to do their job, and we'll see what happens with these investigations. It's hard to tell at this point exactly what they're going after, but we do know that Michael Cohen, in federal court under oath, basically said that Donald Trump directed him to make payments that turned out to be felony campaign finance violations. I'm sure prosecutors will want to know who else in the Trump organization knew about that.
How do you think the president will react, Congressman, if his children are drawn into these investigations?
It is a matter of debate whether or not the President of the United States can be indicted. There's no debate whether the president's children can be indicted or his son-in-law. They absolutely can. And so we're going to wait and see what happens with these investigations.
We can see from the subpoena of the Trump inauguration committee that investigators are looking into various subjects, including foreign money. But this investigation is separate from Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. What does that tell you?
That Americans understand the one thing that makes America great is the rule of law. And we have investigators, law enforcement personnel, and prosecutors that take their oaths very seriously. They're going to investigate and go where the evidence leads them, even if this is the President of the United States or his family.
Have you seen any evidence at all that President Trump's inaugural committee actually broke the law?
I personally have not, but what we do know is that this president and some of his family members do not seem to care at all about the emoluments clause or having foreign influence affect their decisions or using taxpayers' money to benefit themselves personally. So it would not surprise me that part of the inaugural committee may have violated crime.
Only one person in this subpoena is named, a man by the name of Imad Zuberi. We heard about him. He's a former Obama and Clinton fundraiser. Are some of these issues under investigation a concern for both political parties?
It certainly could be based on public reporting. It looks like what they're looking at are activities associated with the Trump inaugural committee. What made this different is a huge amount of money was raised, but only part of it was spent. And so I think prosecutors are trying to figure out, well, where did the other millions of dollars go? Did they go to enrich Donald Trump or his associates, or were they legitimately spent on legitimate activities?
The acting Attorney General, Matt Whitaker, as you know, he's agreed to testify publicly before your committee, the House Judiciary Committee, this coming Friday. So why has the chairman, Jerry Nadler, prepared a subpoena for Whitaker if he's voluntarily going to appear?
Because in the past, we have seen administration officials say that they're not going to answer a question by saying that they're thinking they might actually use a White House privilege, but not actually go ahead and use it. You can't do that. You have to either answer the question or exercise your privilege. So if Matt Whitaker simply says he's not going to answer the question and doesn't exercise a privilege, we will subpoena him on the spot and compel him to testify.
That hearing will be open to the public, right?
Yes, it'll be this Friday. It'll be open to the public in the House Judiciary Committee.
The window, meanwhile, is narrowing to try to reach a deal on border security. Is there anything the president could say in his address to Congress tonight that would move you towards a compromise, including some funding for some sort of steel barrier, at least along part of the border with Mexico?
It would be helpful if the president actually acknowledged basic facts. So last year, Donald Trump's own words, he said that border crossings were at a 45-year low. We know from the latest FBI statistics that violent and property crime are down across the United States. And study after study shows that immigrants commit less crime than native-born Americans. If we can agree on those facts, then we can move forward and look at the border and say, okay, what discrete areas might actually need some physical barriers? And by the way, have you seen a map of the administration that they've shown you with a border wall across the southern border? They haven't shown such a map because most of the border, in fact, doesn't need a wall.
If the president does go ahead and declare a national emergency and decide to go ahead, find money elsewhere, build the wall on his own without formal congressional appropriation, what will you and your fellow Democrats do?
We will see the president in court. I note that if there was a national emergency, Donald Trump would not have golfed this weekend, nor would he have waited over 2 years before declaring a national emergency. When Congress writes laws, we expect the words to mean what they say, national emergency. And you don't wait over 2 years and say it's a national emergency, and clearly there is none.
Congressman Ted Lieu, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wolf.
The breaking news continues next as we learn new details tonight about the State of the Union speech and what President Trump will be saying. Also breaking, CNN has learned that federal prosecutors have requested interviews with top executives at the Trump Organization. The countdown to President Trump's State of the Union speech tonight. CNN has learned federal prosecutors have been seeking interviews with top Trump Organization executives. The news comes just after we learned that federal prosecutors also have subpoenaed the Trump Inaugural Committee. Let's dig deeper into all of this with our experts and our analysts. Susan Hennessy, what does it tell you that federal prosecutors want to talk to these Trump Organization executives?
Look, I think it's unequivocally bad news for the president. You know, we've all been really focused on the Mueller probe, but I do think that this illustrates the degree of risk that the investigations in the Southern District of New York might pose to the president. You know, the Mueller investigation has a limited mandate. The Southern District of New York does not have that mandate. So whenever Trump talks about looking into the Trump Organization as being a potential red line, that just doesn't apply for these prosecutors. I do think it's really, really telling that we don't even know which of the investigations into the president this might be related to. Is this related to the campaign finance violations as revealed by Michael Cohen? Does this have something to do with the investigations into the inaugural committee? Or does this have something to do with some other line of inquiry that we don't even know about? So it does sort of illustrate just really the sprawling and enduring nature of what he's up against.
We have no way of telling, Jeff, how the president is going to react to federal prosecutors potentially looking into the activities of his children.
I think we have a good idea, and I think you won't like it. I mean, as Susan said, he has talked about that red line of course, his finances, but there is no one who is closer to him, that he tries to protect more than his children. So we know up until this point, his children were involved in the campaign, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, his daughter Ivanka Trump at the White House as well as the campaign. So I think we do know how he'll react. The question is he can't really do much about it because this is not the special counsel. This is the Southern District of New York. I mean, he appointed the person leading that office. So the reality here is we don't exactly know where this is going. If you have to put in context everything that has happened so far, I think that this investigation is the one that could worry them the most. This is why, because it gets to the closest inner circle of his orbit, his actual friends. Some of the campaign people that have been charged, they weren't that close to him. These people and his family, so close to him.
And Gloria, in addition to, investigating the Trump Organization, federal prosecutors are also looking at the Trump Inauguration Committee, and they're looking at these potential crimes, and I'll put them up on the screen: conspiracy against the United States, false statements, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, disclosure violations, contributions from foreign nationals, contributions in the name of another person. That's big league.
Well, it is. All of this is big league. Even the fact that people from the Trump Organization, as we're reporting, have been called in. I think if you take a step back for a minute, the Mueller investigation may be winding down, but the Southern District of New York seems to be just revving up at this particular point. And I think that does pose perhaps the biggest risk to the president. What does he care about the most? He cares about his business. What does he care about also the most? He cares about his family. And those are two things that could be in jeopardy as a result of these investigations. We don't know where they're going. We don't know what they have. But we do know that Mueller was pretty smart. And what he did was he looked at his, what he's assigned to do, which is the Russian hacking of the election. He said, this is my mandate. But when he came across things, he referred it. And that is exactly what we're seeing right now. So those investigations can continue while the president is president.
And take a look at this, David Swirlick. The inaugural committee funds that were raised by the Trump inauguration as compared to other presidents, and we'll put them up on the screen. Take a look at this. $107 million was raised by the Trump inauguration committee in 2017. But if you take a look at what Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton raised, that's twice as much, if not more, than they raised, and that's raised some questions.
It's raised some questions. We still need to know more. As everybody has said, with each thread of these investigations, with each story that comes out about this administration, just on a political level, whether it's inappropriate behavior by cabinet officials, whether it's the Trump Hotel, the inauguration, the bigger investigations, Stormy Daniels, you have a much more difficult situation for the president, for the people around him, to say that all of this is a witch hunt, that they're being unfairly targeted either by the Southern District of New York or by the special counsel's investigation. These things are weaving closer and closer into the president.
You know, there's one more thing I want to add here, which is we should not be shocked that people were trying to buy access to a new administration or to the president of the United States through the inauguration.
Especially one they didn't think he would win.
Right.
Those others, the Obama campaign and the Bush campaigns, people largely knew where these were going, at least the second one. But the Trump was a surprise.
Right.
So people wanted to send in checks.
Exactly. So we weren't born yesterday. This happens, but not at this particular level because people weren't betting on Donald Trump, as you were saying.
And his inauguration was smaller than all of those.
I heard that, the picture.
Susan, look at this. These various investigations involving Trump and various aspects of the president's life. Even if the Mueller investigation wraps up, the Trump Organization being investigated, Southern District of New York, the Trump Foundation, the New York State Attorney General's office, Trump campaign, the special counsel, and Congress is looking into it. Trump transition, the special counsel, that's Mueller. Trump inauguration, the Southern District of New York, the Trump administration, special counsel, and Congress. It suggests that this is going to go on, and maybe throughout the next 2 years.
Right. So the remarkable common denominator there is Trump. You know, I do think that it illustrates that this is virtually guaranteed to sort of go beyond the Mueller probe. You know, and I do think it's important to keep in mind that these are just the criminal investigations, right? We also have a whole other set of congressional investigations. The House investigation has now been revitalized. The Senate investigation is ongoing. That Senate investigation report, from the time the investigation concludes, we don't even know that it's about to conclude, but from the time it concludes, it's going to take another 6 months to go through a really onerous clearance process. So as the president is facing, all of these various issues, there's going to be more and more and more shoes to drop because these other big Senate reports are also looming out there.
But I think politically, though, a lot of that becomes sort of common noise, if you will, up on Capitol Hill. That's why I think these investigations with the Southern District of New York are so different that they could agitate the president. This does not mean, we should be very clear about this, this doesn't mean the president's base is going to depart him. Politically speaking, they almost certainly will not. What it means is his reaction. How does he react to all of this, and what does it cause him to do? That is the open question here. And imagine what's in his mind tonight. His mindset is he's about to give his State of the Union address. The timing is not great if you want a president sort of, calm and collected and focusing on the matter at hand. It's a distraction.
Well, a lot of investigations, including investigations of his children, which is clearly what once was thought of to be a red line, Gloria, that these investigators should not cross.
Well, and the children and his business are the same thing in many ways. And don't forget, the Trump Organization, like the Trump campaign, was not run by a lot of people. It's a very small sort of nuclear hierarchy with his children. Used to be Michael Cohen, Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer, who has gotten limited immunity to testify. So there are other people, but I would say, it's less than a dozen. Donald Trump knows all of them very well. He clearly has some indication that something is going on here, and it would bother him because instead of one witch hunt, as he calls it, he's now going to say there are many witch hunts.
And Matt Whitaker, the acting attorney general, is going to testify before the House Judiciary Committee on Friday, and who knows how the Democrats are in the majority, how that's going to potentially explode.
Right. This is going to be one of these first tastes of Democrats having control of these committees and being able to ask questions that Republicans perhaps didn't ask in the last Congress. And it will be interesting to see whether Whitaker provides new information or if he tries to sort of stick with a line that's already been out there from the Trump Justice Department.
And you heard Congressman Ted Lieu, Susan, say that if he doesn't answer certain questions that the Democratic majority thinks he must answer, they'll immediately on the spot file some sort of subpoena.
Right, so this is going to be an illustration, as David said, of the power of oversight. We've seen a lot of witnesses that have come before the committee and some cabinet members sort of try and play a cute game in which they basically say they're not going to answer a question without formally asserting their privilege. And so this is, the congressman is indicating that the Democrats are really going to hold their feet to the fire. They're going to say, look, if you actually want to assert the privilege in a manner in which we can litigate if we don't think it's appropriate, then you have to do so. But we're not going to sort of back off in the way our Republican colleagues were inclined to in the past.
A whole new different world in the House of Representatives right now. Everybody stick around. Much more on the breaking news right after this. Our correspondents and our experts at Jeff Zeleny, we're hearing the president will try to appeal to the Democrats tonight on the issue of immigration, but he seems to be writing off the possibility of a deal for border wall funding with the Democrats. You think he's already resigned to this notion that maybe he's going to go ahead and declare a national emergency? We're told he's been meeting with contractors over at the White House today.
He has been. By all indications, everyone we talked to at the White House and in his orbit, they do believe he is going to do this. Not tonight. We do not expect him to declare this national emergency tonight in the House chamber. Of course, he could always make that change, call an audible, if you will, but people do expect that to happen, and here's why. It's one of the only ways that he can, at least politically speaking, save face among his base and among some of his supporters on the right, but people who believe he hasn't been strong enough here. So he's going to walk a line. We're told during the speech tonight he's going to call for unity. I'm told by people who have seen the speech there are several examples and calls for unity. There were last year as well. I think they will probably ring more hollow this year. The credibility factor is not high on either side. We talk a lot about how much Democrats are going to applaud. I'm going to be looking at Republicans tonight as well, because there are a lot of Republicans who do not want him to call for a national emergency. They think it's the wrong choice here, but all indications are eventually he'll do that.
You think, Gloria, the speech tonight will change the needle at all as far as the border security negotiations are concerned?
Well, our Hill team is reporting that behind closed doors, the border negotiations are going very well. If you left it up to members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, maybe they could cut a deal. The big question mark, as ever, is what is Donald Trump going to do? And what would he sign on to? It seems to me that he's in a box. There's a wall or slats or whatever you want to call it, but that's what he wants. And if those negotiators don't come out with $5.7 billion for what he wants, he's kind of dug himself in. And that's the big question here. Will he sign on to something? Or will he declare this national emergency, which, by the way, can be disapproved by Congress, including many of his Republicans in the Senate, and that's a risk for him.
It would need resolutions of disapproval in the House and Senate, but he could veto. Then you would need two-thirds to override.
But what would happen is he would force Republicans to go on the record on this, and they don't want to. They don't want to.
It's a serious problem right now, David. Is there a face-saving option available for the president? Let's say he doesn't get all the money for a border wall or a steel barrier that he wants.
I think the problem for the president and for Republicans is that the face-saving option is declaring a national emergency, because even if he loses a legal challenge to it down the road, at least he can take that fight back to his base, back to the 40% of people who are behind him, back to conservative pundits and say, I did everything I could do. I tried to fight. Congress and the courts thwarted me. But in these negotiations that are going on, like Gloria is saying, people can make a deal in Congress, but can Trump accept a deal that doesn't include funding specifically for a wall? Probably not for his base. And Democrats can't give that to him unless they want to go crossways with their base. And that's where we are.
Susan, we're told a big chunk of the speech tonight, it could go on for an hour with applause, sitting down, standing up, and all of that will be on foreign policy, national security, whether North Korea, whether China, whether Iran, U.S. troops in Syria, U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's going to be a big chunk of the speech. What are you going to be listening for?
Yeah, so I think if the past is any indication, we're going to hear the president try and claim a lot of victories, and frankly, we're going to hear him potentially make a lot of stuff up. So it actually took many, many months after his prior State of the Union through Freedom of Information Act request to sort of nail down some of those claims he made about federal agencies making particular representations to him. It might even be more of a fact-checking challenge this year because he has arguably less good news on the foreign policy front. North Korea nuclear program is continuing. ISIS is not defeated. NATO allies continue to be incredibly spooked. And so usually whenever we're looking at sort of a coherent foreign policy vision from a president, the really unusual thing about Donald Trump is he doesn't usually talk about policy at all. He usually talks about himself. And so whenever we've seen him discuss foreign policy in the past, it's usually through the lens of who's been nice to him, who's fair, who's unfair, and isn't really about policy at all.
He really wants to get those troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. He thinks both have been a disaster for the United States. The U.S. has wasted trillions and trillions of dollars, he says, and look what the U.S. has gotten for it, basically nothing.
And I think that's the argument he's going to make. And I think that argument will find a receptive audience by some Americans who are, seeing the longest war in history. But up until this point, he's not really brought the country along to this idea. He's tweeted his ideas. He's, not fully explained it. So tonight he does have the opportunity, as the country watches, to make this case. We'll see how much he actually dwells on that, because we know it was a bit of a spur-of-the-moment decision. People sitting in the chamber know that ISIS has not been defeated. The Republicans and Democrats know that. So he faces a bit of a challenge on that. But we should remember, in these nights when he gives big speeches on a teleprompter, he's generally far, far, far different than when he's tweeting or when he's talking off the cuff on the South Lawn or in the Oval Office. So expect a more restrained president this evening and someone who is speaking, a prepared speech. The real question, what comes tomorrow morning and the days after?
The president will speak for about an hour, David Swerdlick. After he leaves the House of Representatives, there'll be a 5-minute break, and then we'll hear from Stacey Abrams, from Georgia. She narrowly lost the gubernatorial contest there.
Yeah, and that does a few things for Democrats. First, it's just an out-of-the-box pick, not a backbench Congress member, but someone from one of the states where Democrats want to make gains. Georgia, they're not giving up on that. It also reminds people of voter manipulation in that race. It also reminds voters that Stacey Abrams, even though she lost her race, is someone who the party wants to push forward, perhaps in a Senate race. Yale law grad, former minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives, sort of a fresh Generation X face. They are saying, look, we have not we're still invested in Stacey Abrams as a candidate.
She's got a tough challenge. It's not easy giving that response to the President of the United States, as we all know from history. Everybody stick around. There's more news. We're following. A top U.S. general says President Trump never spoke to him about withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria and that the fight against ISIS is not over.
Republicans to go on the record on this, and they don't want to. They don't want to.
It's a serious problem right now. David, is there a face-saving option available for the president? Let's say he doesn't get all the money for a border wall or a steel barrier that he wants.
I think the problem for the president and for Republicans is that the face-saving option is declaring a national emergency, because even if he loses a legal challenge to it down the road, at least he can take that fight back to his base, back to the 40% of people who are behind him, back to conservative pundits and say, I did everything I could do. I tried to fight. Congress and the courts thwarted me. But in these negotiations that are going on, like Gloria is saying, people can make a deal in Congress, but can Trump accept a deal that doesn't include funding specifically for a wall, probably not for his base, and Democrats can't give that to him unless they want to go crossways with their base, and that's where we are.
Susan, we're told a big chunk of the speech tonight, it could go on for an hour with applause, sitting down, standing up, and all of that will be on foreign policy, national security, whether North Korea, whether China, whether Iran, U.S. troops in Syria, U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's going to be a big chunk of the speech. What are you going to be listening for?
Yeah, so I think if the past is any indication, we're going to hear the president try and claim a lot of victories, and frankly, we're going to hear him potentially make a lot of stuff up. So it actually took many, many months after his prior State of the Union through Freedom of Information Act request to sort of nail down some of those claims he made about federal agencies making particular representations to him. It might even be more of a fact-checking challenge this year because he has arguably less good news on the foreign policy front. North Korea nuclear program is continuing. ISIS is not defeated. NATO allies continue to be incredibly spooked. And so usually whenever we're looking at sort of a coherent foreign policy vision from a president, The really unusual thing about Donald Trump is he doesn't usually talk about policy at all. He usually talks about himself. And so whenever we've seen him discuss foreign policy in the past, it's usually through the lens of who's been nice to him, who's fair, who's unfair. It isn't really about policy at all.
He really wants to get those troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. He thinks both have been a disaster for the United States. The U.S. has wasted trillions and trillions of dollars, he says, and look what the U.S. has gotten for it, basically nothing.
And I think that's the argument he's going to make. And I think that argument will find a receptive audience by some Americans who are, seeing the longest war in history. But up until this point, he's not really brought the country along to this idea. He's tweeted his ideas. He's, not fully explained it. So tonight he does have the opportunity, as the country watches, to make this case. We'll see how much he actually dwells on that, because we know it was a bit of a spur-of-the-moment decision. People sitting in the chamber know that ISIS has not been defeated. The Republicans and Democrats know that. So he faces a bit of a challenge on that. But we should remember, in these nights when he gives big speeches on a teleprompter, he's generally far, far, far different than when he's tweeting or when he's talking off the cuff on the South Lawn or in the Oval Office. So expect a more restrained president this evening and someone who is speaking, a prepared speech. The real question, what comes tomorrow morning and the days after?
The president will speak for about an hour, David Swerdlick. After he leaves the House of Representatives, there'll be a 5-minute break, and then we'll hear from Stacey Abrams, from Georgia. She narrowly lost the gubernatorial contest there.
Yeah, and that does a few things for Democrats. First, it's just an out-of-the-box pick, not a backbench Congress member, but someone from one of the states where Democrats want to make gains. Georgia, they're not giving up on that. It also reminds people of voter manipulation in that race. It also reminds voters that Stacey Abrams, even though she lost her race, is someone who the party wants to push forward, perhaps in a Senate race. Yale law grad, former minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives, sort of a fresh Generation X face. They're saying, look, we have not we're still invested in Stacey Abrams as a candidate.
She's got a tough challenge. It's not easy giving that response to the President of the United States, as we all know from history. Everybody stick around. There's more news. We're following. A top U.S. general says President Trump